There's a question historians have argued about for centuries. How do you defeat Rome? You study their formations. You learn their weaknesses. You find a way through. But what if the answer was never about Rome at all? What if the empire that held Rome back for 700 years never tried to defeat it? What if they just had to be something Rome could not fight? This is not a story about 5 battles. This is a story about 5 different ways the same wall can crack. And the water that found every single one. In 53 BC, a Roman general named Crassus marched 50,000 men into the Syrian desert. He was not a soldier by instinct. He was the richest man in Rome, and that was the problem. Caesar had Gaul. Pompey had the East. Crassus had money. And after crushing Spartacus's rebellion, his confidence had reached a point where money no longer felt like enough. He wanted his name written into Roman history as the man who first conquered Persia. He wanted a war. He wanted a triumph. He wanted Parthia. What he got was something Rome had never seen before. Think of it this way. A gladiator steps into the arena. He has trained for this his entire life. How to close the distance, how to read a body, how to end a fight in the space of a breath. Everything he knows assumes one thing, that eventually the enemy will be close enough to touch. The gates open on the other side. No one walks out. Only arrows. The Parthian commander, a man named Carrhae, brought no siege engines, no infantry lines, no pitched battle waiting to happen. He brought horse archers, thousands of them, and a supply train of 10,000 camels loaded with nothing but arrows. The Romans locked their shields. They formed their lines. They waited for the enemy to come close enough to fight. The enemy never came close. Parthian cavalry circled the Roman formation, always just beyond reach, and fired. Not in one volley. Not in one charge that could be braced for and answered. They fired continuously, relentlessly. One wave pulling back as another came forward, the camel train resupplying them without pause. The first arrow did not break the legion. The 100th arrow did not break the legion. But each arrow was a question the formation had no answer for. How do you advance when the enemy won't stand still? How do you hold the line when the man beside you just fell? How do you stay a wall when the wall has nowhere to push against? A legion is not just men. It is a single thing, shields locked, ranks intact, every soldier part of one mass that moves and breathes together. That is where the strength lives, not in any one man, in the shape they make together. Carrhae understood this, and he had a simple belief. If 1,000 arrows were not enough, then 10,000. If 10,000 were not enough, then 1,000,000. He was not waiting for Rome to break. He was waiting for Rome to answer a question it did not know how to answer. For hours, Rome had no answer. Crassus's son led a cavalry charge to break the encirclement. He never came back. When his head was brought forward on a spear, the Romans did not collapse immediately. They just stopped being one thing. Shields drifted apart. Ranks lost their edges. Men who had trained their entire lives to hold a formation found themselves standing alone in the desert, still armed, still breathing, but no longer a legion. Just 50,000 individuals with nowhere to go. 20,000 died that day. 10,000 were captured. Crassus himself was killed during negotiations, betrayed, surrounded, cut down in the dust of a campaign that had never found its battle. Rome did not lose because it fought badly. Rome lost because the water never came close enough to fight. The great block of earth pushed forward, and the waters simply wore it down, slowly, patiently, without a single decisive blow, until what had been a wall was nothing more than mud. Nothing more, nothing less. 13 years after Carrhae, Rome tried again. The second triumvirate had divided the world into 3. Lepidus was gone. Octavian held the west. Mark Antony held everything else. The richest provinces, the oldest cities, the armies that had fought beside Caesar himself. If anyone could erase the shame of Carrhae, it was him. And he needed to. Not just for history, not just for Rome. Antony had spent the last several years in Alexandria, living openly with Cleopatra, granting Roman territories to their children. A triumph over the empire that had killed Crassus, that had humiliated Rome for 13 years, that would make him untouchable. Octavian could whisper whatever he wanted to the Senate. A man who had avenged Carrhae needed no defense. He needed to win, and he needed to win fast. So he prepared. He learned from Carrhae. He brought cavalry to answer the horse archers. He brought a larger army. And he brought a siege train, the catapults, the battering rams, the siege towers that would crack open Parthian cities. Because Antony understood what Crassus had not. You cannot chase water across a desert. You have to take away the ground it stands on. The plan was sound. The army was ready. The campaign began well. And then he made one decision that unraveled everything. He was moving fast. The siege train was slow. It always is. Heavy machines, oxen, wagons. They don't march, they crawl. Keeping them with the main army meant slowing down. Slowing down meant Octavian had more time. Meant the campaign dragged into winter. So he left them behind. 2 legions to guard the siege train. The rest of the army pushed forward. I often wonder what Antony was thinking in those days at the front of that column. Did he believe Parthia would simply surrender at the sight of him? That his reputation alone would do what the siege engines were supposed to do? No one knows. Maybe he didn't either. Parthia saw the cavalry. They did not take the risk. Instead, they made a far simpler choice. The 2 legions guarding the siege train never had a chance. The Parthians hit them fast, overwhelmed them, and destroyed everything. Every catapult, every ram, every tower. Not captured, destroyed, completely. When the news reached Antony, his army was intact. His soldiers were alive. His cavalry was ready. He had nothing left to win with. He marched on Ctesiphon anyway. For what? I don't know. He stood outside the walls of the Parthian capital with the most powerful army Rome had sent east in a generation. And he could not touch it. No siege engines. No way to force a battle on ground that would favor him. Just an army standing in the open, watching a city that would not fall, in a campaign that had already been decided 300 miles behind them. The retreat was long. Parthian cavalry followed the entire way, not to destroy, just to bleed. Skirmishes every day, supply lines cut, men dying in the Armenian winter, not from battle, but from hunger and cold. By the time Antony reached safety, he had lost 1/3 of his army. No single catastrophic defeat, no last stand, just the accumulated cost of continuing a war that had already ended when the siege train burned. Antony had done what Crassus had not. He had studied the enemy. He had prepared the right tools. He had built a plan that could have worked. But water does not care about plans. It does not wear an army down arrow by arrow, hour by hour, the way it had at Carrhae. This time it moved differently. It found the one point where the weight of everything rested. The siege train, the condition of victory, the thing Antony had left with 2 legions because he was in a hurry, and took it. Not the army, not the general, not the will to fight. Just the one thing, without which none of it mattered. The rest collapsed on its own. 3 centuries had passed since Carrhae. Rome and Parthia had fought to exhausted stalemates, signed treaties, broken them, and fought again. The borders shifted, but never collapsed. Both empires bled, rested, and bled again. It was the kind of conflict that had stopped feeling like a war and started feeling like weather, something you prepared for, endured, and survived. And then Parthia was gone. In 224 AD, a Persian nobleman named Ardashir overthrew the last Parthian king and built something new on the same ground, the Sassanid Empire. Same land, different people, different ambition. By 260 AD, Rome was not the empire that had marched into Parthia under Crassus. The crisis of the 3rd century had torn through it. Rome was at its weakest point in centuries, and the 70,000 men Valerian brought east were the most physically exhausted army Rome had fielded in a generation. Plague had already moved through the ranks before the first battle was fought. The Emperor Valerian marched east anyway. He brought imperial authority. He brought the assumption that an emperor in the field, the living center of Roman power, would be enough to hold the line. What he brought was not enough. The Sassanid cataphracts did not circle and harass the way Sharina's horse archers had at Carrhae. They did not strike the supply lines and disappear the way the Parthians had against Antony. They closed in, heavy, armored, relentless. They wrapped around the Roman army and held. Water surrounding earth, waiting for it to sink. Why didn't the Romans break through? They could have tried. But 70,000 sick, exhausted men pushing into a wall of armored cavalry was not a breakout. It was a massacre waiting to happen. So they held their ground, and the ground got smaller. At some point, the army stopped being an army. Valerian, Emperor of Rome, ruler of the greatest empire on earth, was captured alive. Some say he was taken in battle. Some say he walked out under a flag of truce, carrying gold, hoping to negotiate his way out of an encirclement that had no other exit. Shapur had him. The emperor was not ransomed. He was not exchanged. He spent the rest of his life in Persian captivity, a living trophy, a breathing monument to the moment the unthinkable had happened. At Naqshi Rustam, the cliff face where the tombs of ancient Persian kings are carved into rock, Shapur had the scene immortalized. A Roman emperor, kneeling, a Persian king, standing over him, cut into stone so deep that it is still there today. Water had not just defeated Earth this time. Water had frozen the moment of defeat and left it there, forever. What followed was not a military response. The empire fractured. Within years, Rome had split into three separate pieces: the Gallic Empire in the west, the Palmyrene Empire in the east, and what remained of the center holding on between them. But here's what the stone carvings at Naqshi Rustam do not show. While Shapur's army marched back east, heavy with victory and prisoners and plunder, a man named Odenathus was watching from the desert. Odenathus was not Roman. He was the king of Palmyra, a city-state at the edge of the Syrian desert. A vassal, technically. A client king who owed his position to Rome's tolerance. Odenathus gathered his cavalry, light Arab horsemen who had grown up in the desert, who knew every ridge and dry riverbed between Syria and Mesopotamia, and went after Shapur. He hit the flanks of the retreating Persian army. He cut supply lines. He harassed and bled and followed, all the way to the Euphrates. Shapur was chased across the river by a desert king Rome had barely paid attention to. Water had done something new this time. At Edessa, it had wrapped around the earth completely, held it, compressed it, and pulled out the center. And when the center was gone, the earth did not just collapse. It shattered into pieces that would spend the next decade trying to remember what shape they were supposed to be. 100 years after Valerian knelt before Shapur, Rome had rebuilt itself. The crisis of the 3rd century was over. The empire had been reunified, restructured, moved its capital east to Constantinople. It had survived things that should have killed it. And it had, once, actually won. In 116 AD, the Emperor Trajan had marched east, broken through every Parthian defense, captured Ctesiphon, and stood at the shore of the Persian Gulf, the furthest east any Roman army had ever gone. Rome had done the impossible. That story belongs to another video. What matters here is what happened after. Trajan's successor looked at everything Trajan had won and gave it back. Not because Rome had lost it, because Rome could not hold it. Too far, too costly, too much. Trajan had brought everything: siege engines, supply lines, every preparation a general could make, and still could not hold what he won. Antony had lost his siege train and lost the war. Julian read both of those stories. What conclusion he drew from them, I honestly do not know. And he marched east anyway. Not just for glory, not just to finish what Crassus had started. Julian was the last emperor who had refused Christianity. In a Roman world that had spent 30 years becoming a Christian empire, he alone still prayed to the old gods. His entire reign was an argument that Rome had been great before Christ and could be great again without him. A victory over Persia was not just a military triumph, it was proof. It was the gods of Rome answering back. If he won, everything he believed was vindicated. If he lost more than a campaign. He burned the ships anyway. 65 supply vessels set on fire on the Euphrates. Some sources say it was to prevent them from falling into Persian hands. Some say it was to force his army forward. No retreat, no hesitation, fight or die. Half a world away, 5 centuries earlier, Xiang Yu, the greatest warrior in Chinese history, had done the same thing. He won the battle. He lost the war. The logic is not crazy. It requires one thing, that victory comes before the supplies run out. Victory did not come. Julian reached Ctesiphon, the Sassanid capital, the same walls Antony had stood before 3 centuries earlier, and found he could not take it. The Persian army stayed behind its walls and did not come out to be destroyed in the open field where Julian was strongest. He stood outside those walls with 65,000 men and nothing left to go back to. This is what Persia did in 363 AD. Nothing. They did not wear Julian down arrow by arrow the way they had at Carrhae. They did not strike his foundations the way they had against Antony. They did not surround and squeeze the way they had at Edessa. They simply refused to lose quickly enough for Julian to survive his own decision. A man had walked into a trap of his own making. Persia did not need to close it. They only needed to wait. The retreat began in late June, into the Mesopotamian summer. The Persians did not meet them in a decisive battle. They had learned, across 300 years of fighting Rome, that decisive battles were where Rome was most dangerous. Cavalry harassed the flanks every day. Supply lines that no longer existed could not be cut, but foraging parties were hunted down. The land had been scorched before the Romans arrived. There was nothing left to eat. Men marched in temperatures that turned armor into an oven. Julian rode up and down the column every day, without his armor, visible to his men, refusing to show what the campaign was costing him. On June 26, 363 AD, during one of the daily skirmishes, a spear caught him in the side. Who threw it is still disputed. Persian cavalry, a Roman deserter, an accident in the chaos. He died that night. The army that had marched in with an emperor who had burned his own ships retreated home with a corpse and a peace treaty that surrendered territory Rome had held for a century. Water had not moved this time. It had simply stood still, behind its walls, in its desert, under its summer sun, and let the earth crack on its own. By 540 AD, Rome was still Rome. It had moved its capital east to Constantinople, spoken Greek instead of Latin, and traded its old gods for a new one. But the emperor still called himself Augustus. The army still called itself Roman. The law, the roads, the idea, all of it still standing. What had changed was not what Rome was. What had changed was how thin it had been stretched. 8 years earlier, Justinian had bought peace. He called it the Eternal Peace. 11,000 pounds of gold, paid up front to Sassanid Persia, in exchange for quiet on the eastern frontier, while Byzantine turned its full attention west. Justinian wanted Italy back, the old heartland, the city of Rome itself, everything the Goths had taken. He sent his best general, Belisarius, with his best army, across the Mediterranean. The eastern border was left with what remained. Khosrow signed the treaty, took the gold, watched Belisarius sail west, and waited. 8 years, long enough for the Gothic wars to drain Byzantine's treasury, long enough for the eastern frontier to go from undermanned to something closer to undefended in the places that mattered. In 540 AD, Khosrow tore up the Eternal Peace and marched west. This was something new. For 6 centuries, this had been Rome's war. Rome marching east, Rome pushing into Persian territory, Rome searching for a decisive victory that never came. Carrhae, Antony, Julian, always Rome going forward and Persia holding. Now Persia was coming forward. Water does not need to be stronger than earth. It only needs to find where the earth is thinnest. Antioch was not thin, not by any ordinary measure. It was one of the greatest cities in the world. 500,000 people, centuries of history, walls that had held against enemies Rome had long since forgotten. It was the capital of the eastern provinces, the jewel of Syria, the city where, according to the Christians who now filled its streets, the followers of Jesus had first been called Christians. Khosrow took it in days. He did not need a long siege. The walls were strong, but the men behind them were not enough, and the army that should have reinforced them was in Italy. Antioch fell the way things fall when the structure that was supposed to hold them has been quietly hollowing out for years, not with a dramatic crack, but with a kind of terrible ease. The city was looted. The population was killed, enslaved, or marched east into Persia. Khosrow took the survivors and built them a new city in Mesopotamia, a city with Roman-style baths, a hippodrome, everything Antioch had, and called it Khosrow's Better Antioch. The name was chosen to humiliate as much as commemorate. Justinian recalled Belisarius from Italy. The great general marched east, skirmished with Sassanid forces, negotiated, maneuvered. He stopped the bleeding. He did not reverse it. Byzantine paid Khosrow again, more gold, more tribute, another peace that both sides knew was temporary. The eastern frontier stabilized into something that looked like a border, but functioned more like a wound that had been bandaged rather than healed. The system had simply been asked to hold too many things at once for too long, with too little left in reserve. Justinian wanted everything: Italy in the east, the old empire restored, the eternal city, and the eternal peace both at once. He was not wrong to want it. Rome had always wanted everything. But wanting everything meant defending everything. And defending everything meant that when Khosrow looked at the map in 532 AD and saw 11,000 pounds of gold sitting on the table, He also saw exactly where Byzantine was not looking. For 6 centuries, water had absorbed every Roman advance, wearing it down, taking its foundations, surrounding it, waiting for it to crack, always on Persian ground, always on Persian terms. In 540 AD, water crossed the border, not because it had finally become stronger than Earth, but because Earth had spent 6 centuries fighting water and forgotten to watch its own banks. 5 defeats. 5 different ways the same wall can crack. Carrhae taught Rome that speed means nothing if the enemy won't stand still. Antony taught Rome to protect what victory depends on. Edessa taught Rome that symbols are not decoration, they are structure. Julian taught Rome that confidence built from knowing every lesson can become its own kind of blindness. Rome learned, Rome adapted, Rome came back every time. And yet, no matter how much Earth learns about water, water remains water. It does not need to be smarter. It does not need to be stronger. It only needs to find the place where Earth has forgotten to be hard. That place always exists. It always will. But this is only half the story. Because Rome did not only lose against Persia, Rome won too, in ways that were just as unexpected, just as strange, just as impossible as these 5 defeats. How does Earth stop water? How does a wall hold against something that has no shape? That is the next video.